Hello, this is a Stories from the Camp. Thank you for visiting us. It would be great if you subscribed and gave us a like, and also write a comment. Enjoy listening. Throughout history, science has been a double-edged scalpel. On one side, it's brought us vaccines, antibiotics, and miraculous surgeries that defy death itself. On the other, a dark legacy of experimentation where human lives were treated as disposable data points. This is not a story about scientific progress. It's a story about the moments when science lost its soul. In this video, we dive into the most bizarre, unethical, and downright horrifying medical experiments ever conducted. Not in the Middle Ages, mind you, but often in the so-called enlightened 20th century. You'll hear about doctors who drilled into brains with ice picks, psychologists who manipulated orphans until they developed speech disorders, government agencies that secretly dosed citizens with LSD just to see what happened, and scientists who froze limbs, infected prisoners, and dissected the living in the name of research. Many of these experiments were carried out with full institutional backing by prestigious universities, national governments, and respected professionals. The terrifying part? They believed they were doing the right thing. So sit back. We're going to peel back the sanitized surface of medical history and expose the madness underneath. Because sometimes the scariest monsters wear lab coats. If there's one procedure that truly captures the phrase mad science, it's the lobotomy, specifically the transorbital lobotomy. It sounds clinical, maybe even futuristic, but in reality, it was a horror show with a white lab coat. In the early 20th century, the world of psychiatry was desperate. Mental illness was poorly understood, treatments were few, and asylums were overflowing. Patients with schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, or even just emotional distress were often locked away for life. There was pressure from governments, families, and doctors to fix them. Enter the lobotomy. Originally developed in the 1930s by Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz, the procedure involves severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for decision-making, personality, and social behavior. Moniz claimed that by disrupting these circuits, he could quiet the turbulent minds of his patients. Incredibly, he won a Nobel Prize for it. But things took a darker turn when an American psychiatrist named Dr. Walter Freeman entered the scene. Freeman wasn't a surgeon. He wasn't even trained to operate. But he was obsessed with the idea that mental illness could be cured quickly and cheaply. In 1946, he developed the transorbital lobotomy, and his chosen tool wasn't a scalpel, but a household ice pick. Here's how it worked. The patient was rendered unconscious, sometimes just with electroshock, and the doctor would slide the ice pick-like instrument above the eyeball, through the thin bone behind it, and into the brain. With a few flicks of the wrist, the connections between the frontal lobes and the rest of the brain were scrambled. No stitches, no sterilized operating rooms. Sometimes the whole procedure took under 10 minutes. Freeman traveled across America in his lobotomobile, performing demonstrations in mental institutions, hospitals, and even small-town clinics. He operated on housewives, war veterans, teenagers, even children as young as 4 years old. By the 1950s, lobotomy had become almost fashionable. Families were told it was a miracle, and for a brief moment, it looked like it worked. But the consequences were catastrophic. Many patients were left with severe brain damage. Some lost all personality. Others became emotionally numb, unable to feel joy, anger, or even pain. Some could no longer care for themselves, regressing to a childlike state. And yet, the medical establishment continued to praise the method. Freeman himself performed over 3,500 lobotomies, often with both arrogance and recklessness. He once lobotomized 25 patients in a single day. He even had a tendency to take before and after photos, not of the brain scans, but of the patients smiling, as if the mutilation had cured them. Eventually, the rise of antipsychotic medications in the late 1950s led to the fall of lobotomy as a mainstream treatment. But the damage was done. Thousands of lives were irreversibly changed, not by illness, but by the very people who were supposed to help. Lobotomy wasn't just bad science. It was a human tragedy carried out with chilling confidence. And it stands today as one of the darkest chapters in the history of modern medicine. If lobotomy was medical cruelty wrapped in a lab coat, then Unit 731 was cruelty completely unmasked, a hellish laboratory built on the premise that human life was nothing more than meat for science. During the 1930s and 1940s, Imperial Japan invaded and occupied large parts of China. Alongside the army marched a secretive and horrifying research program known as Unit 731, officially titled the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Guangdong Army. Don't be fooled by the name. This was not about health. This was about weaponized science, carried out with no moral constraints. Headquartered in Harbin, Manchuria, Unit 731 was overseen by General Shiro Ishii, a physician with a god complex and a vision for biological warfare. He believed Japan could win wars not with bullets, but with bacteria. And to perfect his methods, he needed test subjects, lots of them. They called them logs, a code word for human beings, mostly Chinese civilians, as well as prisoners of war from Russia, Korea, and even some allied nations. These people were herded into cells, stripped of rights, and subjected to some of the most barbaric experiments ever committed in the name of science. Victims were vivisected alive, cut open without anesthesia to observe organs in motion. Some were infected with the plague, cholera, anthrax, and then dissected so researchers could study the progress of disease in real time. Limbs were amputated and reattached on the opposite side of the body. Others were frozen alive to test how much cold a body could endure before limbs snapped like twigs. Women were forced into sexual experiments, often infected with syphilis and gonorrhea to study venereal disease. Pregnant women were cut open mid-gestation to observe fetal development under stress. There was no mercy, no consent, no medical justification beyond what if. Prisoners were locked in pressure chambers until their eyes burst. Some were starved to death. Others were dehydrated intentionally or injected with seawater to see if it could replace saline. The unit also tested biological weapons by dropping plague-infected fleas onto villages or poisoning water supplies to observe how disease spread. All of this was done under the guise of research. But what they really created was a factory of death, run with bureaucratic efficiency and clinical coldness. It is estimated that up to 300,000 people died as a result of Unit 731's activities, either in the facility itself or from field experiments carried out across China. And here's the most shocking part. None of the perpetrators were ever tried for war crimes. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the United States secretly agreed to grant immunity to Unit 731 scientists in exchange for their research data. Yes, the results of these horrific experiments were considered valuable enough that justice was pushed aside for scientific gain during the early days of the Cold War. Shiro Ishii and many of his staff lived long lives. Some even went on to hold prestigious positions in Japan's post-war medical and academic institutions. Meanwhile, their victims were buried in mass graves, their names forgotten, their suffering erased from most history books. Unit 731 wasn't just unethical. It was the weaponization of medicine, the total abandonment of human empathy in pursuit of knowledge. It stands today as one of the clearest examples of what happens when science serves power instead of humanity. When you hear the phrase mind control, you might think of sci-fi movies, conspiracy theories, or tinfoil hat types. But in mid-20th century America, mind control wasn't just a fantasy. It was a real classified government project, run by the CIA, funded by taxpayers, and aimed at bending the human brain to its will. Its name was MKUltra, and it remains one of the most chilling programs in U.S. intelligence history. Born out of Cold War paranoia in the early 1950s, MKUltra was the CIA's attempt to weaponize the human mind. Agency leaders feared that the Soviets or Chinese had already developed techniques to brainwash prisoners of war. So, naturally, the U.S. decided it needed to do the same, or better. The result was a sprawling, secretive network of human experimentation, often done without consent, and sometimes without the test subjects even knowing they were part of an experiment. At its core, MKUltra revolved around the question: could a human be broken, reprogrammed, and rebuilt to serve someone else's purpose? To find out, the CIA turned to psychiatrists, chemists, hypnotists, and torture specialists. Over 150 subprojects were launched under the MKUltra umbrella, ranging from hypnosis studies to sensory deprivation to massive doses of LSD. LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, was the crown jewel of MKUltra. CIA scientists believed that the drug could break down a person's personality, lower their defenses, and open their mind to suggestion. So they began testing it, not in labs, but on unsuspecting people. In some cases, they dosed civilians at bars, universities, hospitals, and even their own agents, just to see what would happen. One of the most infamous deaths tied to MKUltra was that of Frank Olson, a U.S. Army bacteriologist. In 1953, Olson was unknowingly given LSD by his CIA colleagues during a retreat. Days later, in a haze of paranoia and disorientation, he either jumped or was pushed from the 13th floor of a New York hotel. The official story changed multiple times. His family didn't find out about the drugging until 2 decades later. But Olson wasn't alone. Prisoners, psychiatric patients, and even terminally ill people were subjected to MKUltra experiments. In Canada, psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron, funded by the CIA, used a technique called psychic driving, which involved drugging patients, playing loops of audio messages for hours or days, and applying electroshock therapy far beyond safe limits. The goal? To erase their minds and rebuild them. The result? Permanent psychological damage. What's worse is that MKUltra had no real oversight. Records were incomplete. Many documents were destroyed in 1973 by order of then CIA Director Richard Helms, just before Congress could investigate. What we know today comes from survivor testimonies, whistleblowers, and a handful of declassified files that escaped the purge. MKUltra was officially shut down in the mid-1970s after public outcry and congressional hearings. But the damage was done. People were used as human guinea pigs. Lives were shattered, and the government had willfully violated its own citizens' rights in the name of national security. Today, MKUltra lives on in pop culture as a symbol of conspiracy. But behind the fiction is a very real truth. When fear and secrecy collide, even democracies can cross into terrifying territory. Sometimes the most disturbing experiments don't involve secret facilities or rogue scientists. Sometimes they happen in plain sight, sanctioned by government agencies, performed by doctors in white coats, and carried out for decades under the banner of public health. Such was the case with the Tuskegee syphilis study, a 40-year deception that turned hundreds of black men into unwitting lab subjects, not to treat them, but to watch them die. It began in 1932 in Macon County, Alabama. The U.S. Public Health Service, working in cooperation with the Tuskegee Institute, set out to study the natural progression of untreated syphilis. But instead of using animal models or laboratory simulations, they chose to use living, breathing men, poor black sharecroppers, as their test subjects. The study involved 600 black men, 399 who had syphilis, and 201 who did not. These men were never told they had syphilis. Instead, they were told they had bad blood, a vague local term used to describe a variety of ailments. They were promised free meals, burial insurance, and free medical care, which they never truly received. And then came the worst part. Even after penicillin became the standard cure for syphilis in 1947, doctors intentionally withheld treatment from the infected man. They were never told that an effective cure existed. Instead, researchers continued to observe the disease destroy their bodies in the name of science. Over the next several decades, these men, and in many cases their wives and children, suffered and died while the U.S. government silently took notes. Some went blind. Others experienced madness as neurosyphilis set in. Children were born with congenital syphilis. All of this was seen as data, part of the study. Why? Because the researchers wanted to know what syphilis looked like in the wild, untreated. They believed that since these men were poor and had limited access to health care anyway, they weren't depriving them of anything. This rationalization served as a moral shield, one that let them watch suffering unfold without lifting a finger. The Tuskegee study continued until 1972. Yes, 40 years, when a whistleblower named Peter Buxton, a former public health service employee, leaked information to the press. The public was horrified. Congressional hearings were launched. The study was immediately shut down, and the survivors were offered treatment. Far too late. In 1997, President Bill Clinton formally apologized on behalf of the United States government. He stood before the remaining survivors and said, "What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say, on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful. And I'm sorry, but no apology can erase the legacy of betrayal." The Tuskegee syphilis study remains a symbol of medical racism, of how science, when divorced from ethics, becomes a weapon. The long shadow of Tuskegee still lingers. It sowed deep distrust to the medical system within Black communities, a distrust that persists to this day. And it serves as a dark reminder. Sometimes the most horrific experiments happen not in secret, but in full view, justified by institutions that claim to heal. When we think of psychological experiments, we often imagine clipboards and inkblot tests, not shattered childhoods. But in 1939, long before ethical review boards or institutional oversight, a group of researchers at the University of Iowa carried out an experiment so cruel, so quietly damaging, it would be buried in silence for decades. It came to be known as the Monster Study, and its victims were children, most of them orphans, whose only crime was trusting the adults around them. The Monster Study was led by Wendell Johnson, a respected speech pathologist and himself a lifelong stutterer. Obsessed with the roots of speech disorders, Johnson believed stuttering was not primarily a biological issue, but a learned behavior, something that could be induced or corrected depending on how a person was treated. To test this, he and his graduate student, Mary Tudor, came up with an experiment. What if you told perfectly fluent children that they had a speech defect? Could you make them stutter? That's exactly what they did. 22 children from the Iowa Soldiers and Sailors Orphans home were chosen for the study. Half of them already had speech impediments. The other half spoke fluently. The children were split into 4 groups and then subjected to positive or negative therapy. The positive group was praised for their speech, encouraged to feel confident and relaxed. But the negative group, including perfectly normal speakers, was told they were stutterers. These children were repeatedly criticized, corrected, and shamed for every perceived mistake. They were told their speech was bad, that they were stammering, even when they weren't. They were made to feel broken, defective, by the very people they trusted to guide and protect them. And the results? Chilling. Some of the children who had spoken fluently before the study became withdrawn, anxious, and hesitant to speak at all. Their speech deteriorated. They developed long-term issues with communication and confidence. The experiment had, in effect, manufactured a speech disorder, not through physical trauma, but through psychological warfare. This was not an accident. It was deliberate psychological conditioning, weaponized language, inflicted on vulnerable children who couldn't understand why the adults around them were suddenly cruel. The researchers never told the children the truth. The damage was done, but the study wasn't even published. It was deemed too controversial, too monstrous, hence the name that later stuck. For decades, the experiment was buried in academic obscurity, its victims forgotten, its perpetrators shielded. It wasn't until the early 2000s that public scrutiny finally reached the study. The surviving test subjects, many still grappling with the emotional scars, began to speak out. Some filed lawsuits. Others simply asked for acknowledgement. In 2007, the state of Iowa issued a formal apology and paid financial settlements to several victims. But no amount of money can reverse the consequences of being told, at age 6 or 7, that your voice is broken and believing it. The monster study stands as a haunting example of how powerful language can be, especially in the hands of those we trust. It showed that psychological harm can be as permanent as physical wounds, that you don't need needles or drugs to destroy someone's confidence. Just the right word said the wrong way. And perhaps most tragically, it proved the researcher's theory. You really can create a stutterer, not through nature, but through nurture, poisoned and twisted by cruelty masquerading as science. Out of all the bizarre medical experiments whispered about in the dark corners of the internet, none have captured the imagination or fear of people like the so-called Soviet sleep experiment. It's the stuff of internet creepypasta, conspiracy lore, and YouTube horror narration. But behind the grotesque imagery and sensational storytelling lies a terrifying question rooted in very real science. What happens when a human body is pushed beyond its natural limits, especially without sleep? According to the most popular version of the tale, in the late 1940s, Soviet researchers locked 5 political prisoners in a sealed chamber, pumping in a stimulant-based experimental gas that prevented them from sleeping. The goal was simple and brutal: test the effects of total sleep deprivation for 30 days. The promise of freedom was dangled before the prisoners if they could last the full duration. At first, the results were what one might expect: irritability, paranoia, hallucinations. But as the days wore on, the descent into madness accelerated. According to the story, the prisoners began to mutilate themselves, tearing into their own flesh, screaming until vocal cords snapped, and begging to be kept awake even after the gas was turned off. Some supposedly died. Others became violent. One was said to have whispered, "We are the madness that lurks within you all." Fiction? Probably. But what's important is that this story resonates for a reason, because sleep deprivation has been studied before, both in Soviet labs and elsewhere, with disturbing results. In reality, both the Soviets and Western powers had conducted grueling experiments on sleep deprivation, especially during the Cold War. Sleep was seen not just as a biological function, but as a weakness, something that could be hacked, weaponized, or broken for the purposes of war and interrogation. In the 1960s, American high school student Randy Gardner stayed awake for 11 days straight under observation, with researchers noting hallucinations, paranoia, memory loss, and even temporary cognitive blackouts. He didn't turn into a monster, but he also didn't recover fully for weeks. The body, as it turns out, doesn't just bounce back from extreme sleep loss. The CIA, the KGB, and other intelligence services experimented with sleep deprivation as a form of psychological torture, not to push human limits, but to break them. Keeping detainees awake for 72 to 96 hours was enough to induce hallucinations, confessions, breakdowns, and psychosis. So while the Soviet sleep experiment, as it's told today, may be fiction, it reflects real, scientific curiosity about the dark potential of sleeplessness. It reflects regimes, both East and West, that have been willing to push human minds into chaos to test theories, extract secrets, or win wars. The human body relies on sleep for healing, memory consolidation, emotional regulation, and immune function. When stripped of it, the brain enters a free fall. Micro-sleeps begin, uncontrollable blackouts that last seconds. Cognitive function shatters. Emotions spiral. Prolonged deprivation can lead to permanent damage, and in extreme cases, even death. That's the horror behind the myth. Not blood or gore, but the terrifying fact that we are fragile, and sleep is the thread holding our consciousness together. In the end, this Soviet sleep experiment endures not because it's real, but because it's believable enough. It lives in the gap between what we know humans have done and what we suspect they're still capable of. It reminds us that sometimes the scariest stories aren't those that come from monsters, but those that come from governments, institutions, and scientists with too much power and too little conscience. When we think of government secrecy, we imagine spies, satellites, or encrypted messages, not coffins. But in the shadow of the Cold War, there was a real U.S. government program that quietly reached into morgues and cemeteries, stealing body parts, often from infants and children, all in the name of national security. This was Project Sunshine, and no, despite the name, it had nothing to do with warmth or light. The project began in the early 1950s, during a time when nuclear paranoia gripped the globe. The United States had detonated the first atomic bombs in 1945, but it wasn't long before scientists started asking dangerous questions. What are the long-term effects of radioactive fallout on the human body? And more importantly, how much radioactive material, especially strontium-90, a byproduct of nuclear explosions, was seeping into human bones? Strontium-90 mimics calcium. When absorbed by the body, it settles into bones and teeth, especially in young, developing bodies. Once there, it emits radiation continuously, increasing the risk of cancer and other long-term health effects. The government needed to understand just how contaminated people were becoming, and fast. Their solution? Steal bones from the dead, globally, secretly. Under Project Sunshine, U.S. researchers, often with the quiet backing of military or diplomatic authorities, began a massive international effort to collect human tissue samples, particularly from infants, children, and young adults. Cadavers from around the world were targeted. In some cases, limbs were removed from corpses without the family's knowledge. In others, whole skeletons were taken, and the remains cremated afterward to cover up the theft. One now infamous example involved the body of a stillborn baby girl taken from a UK hospital in the 1950s. Her mother was never informed that her daughter's body had been stripped of bones and shipped to the United States for radiation testing. The discovery came decades later, triggering outrage, media investigations, and government apologies. Project Sunshine's methods weren't just unethical, they were macabre, bordering on ghoulish. Consent was rarely, if ever, obtained. The families of the deceased were kept completely in the dark. Even high-level participants in the program would later describe their actions with a tone of unease. But at the time, this was viewed as a necessary evil in the race against Soviet nuclear expansion. The program ran for over a decade, collecting more than 1,500 samples from people across continents. Most of them were children. The data gathered was, indeed, valuable. It helped scientists understand how radioactive particles entered the food chain and spread through the population. But that scientific gain came at a massive ethical cost. When Project Sunshine was finally made public in the 1990s, long after it had concluded, there was shock and public outrage. Not only had the U.S. government admitted to secretly collecting body parts, but it had also done so under a name that seemed almost designed to mock the families of the victims. Sunshine? There was nothing bright about it. The truth is, Project Sunshine was never about sunlight. It was about the dark lengths governments will go to when they're afraid of losing a war, of falling behind, of being exposed. It was about treating human bodies as data points. And most disturbingly, it was about making those decisions without asking the people they affected most. Today, Project Sunshine serves as a grim reminder that science without ethics is just experimentation. And sometimes that experimentation is conducted not on the living, but on those who can no longer speak for themselves. In 1939, in the shadow of World War II and decades before ethical review boards became standard, a group of American researchers carried out a speech experiment so unethical, so damaging, it would be hushed up for more than 60 years. The experiment, later dubbed the Monster Study, didn't involve chemicals or surgery. Its weapon of choice was words, wielded against vulnerable children. The Monster Study was conducted at the University of Iowa by Wendell Johnson, a respected speech pathologist, and one of his graduate students, Mary Tudor. Johnson himself had struggled with stuttering as a child and was determined to understand and perhaps cure the condition. But his theories, while innovative, carried a dangerous assumption. What if stuttering wasn't entirely biological, but could actually be caused by suggestion? Could you make a child stutter by convincing them that something was wrong with their speech? To find out, they didn't use adult volunteers or clinical patients. They used orphans. 22 children from the Iowa Soldiers and Sailors Orphans Home were selected for the study. Half of them already showed signs of stuttering. The other half spoke fluently. This second group, the fluent speakers, would become the true test subjects. They were divided into two groups. One was praised for their speech, encouraged to speak freely, and reassured that everything they said was normal and fine. The other, however, was deliberately targeted. These children, all of whom spoke normally, were subjected to constant criticism. They were told they had a speech defect. They were warned to speak carefully, not to stutter, to avoid making mistakes. Over time, the pressure mounted. The children became anxious, withdrawn. Some even stopped speaking altogether. The results were as horrifying as they were clear. Several of the previously fluent children developed speech issues, including symptoms resembling stuttering. Some never recovered fully. Their self-esteem plummeted. They became socially withdrawn. A few developed full-blown speech pathologies that haunted them into adulthood. And this was the 1930s. There were no therapists assigned, no follow-up care, and certainly no apologies. Wendell Johnson, worried about the reaction from both the academic world and the public, buried the study. It remained unpublished for decades. Mary Tudor herself would later call it the worst mistake of her life. But for the children involved, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a lifetime of pain planted by someone who had promised to study speech, not destroy it. The monster study was rediscovered in the late 1990s, and public outrage followed. In 2001, the state of Iowa issued a formal apology to the surviving participants and paid financial compensation. But for many, no amount of money could undo the damage caused by being treated like a lab rat at such a young, impressionable age. What makes a monster study so chilling isn't just the harm it caused. It's how ordinary it seemed at the time. The researchers weren't monsters in the classic sense. They were university staff, acting under the banner of science. They weren't sadists, but they were reckless. And their actions remind us that when curiosity overrides compassion, science can become just as dangerous as any weapon. In the end, the monster study didn't just teach us about speech. It taught us about the terrifying power of authority, the vulnerability of children, and a line that should never be crossed, even in the name of knowledge. In the deep American South, under the heat of Jim Crow laws and systemic racism, one of the most horrifying and deliberate medical deceptions in U.S. history unfolded. Not in secret, but in plain sight. From 1932 to 1972, for 40 years, the United States government ran a study that let men suffer and die from a preventable disease, all for the sake of observing what would happen if they weren't treated. This was the Tuskegee syphilis study, a name now synonymous with medical betrayal. It began in Macon County, Alabama, where the U.S. Public Health Service, PHS, launched a study to track the natural progression of untreated syphilis in black men. Researchers recruited 600 African-American men, 399 of whom were infected with the disease. But here's the catch. They weren't told they had syphilis. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local term used to describe various illnesses including anemia, fatigue, and syphilis. In exchange for their participation, the men were promised free medical exams, meals, and burial insurance. But they were never given the treatment that could have saved their lives. Even after penicillin was widely accepted as a cure for syphilis in the 1940s, the doctors deliberately withheld it. Instead, the researchers watched as the men's health deteriorated and the disease ravaged their bodies, leading to blindness, insanity, organ failure, and death. The study was never about helping them. It was about studying them. The participants, many of whom were poor sharecroppers, trusted the white doctors in the crisp government-issued lab coats. They believed they were receiving medical care. Some even continued participating after suffering devastating symptoms. But the real goal was data, not healing. To make matters worse, the men weren't the only victims. Many of their wives became infected, and some children were born with congenital syphilis, all while government officials lied, manipulated, and blocked access to real treatment. This wasn't the work of a rogue scientist. The Tuskegee study was supported by the U.S. Public Health Service, the CDC, and even local black doctors, who were often unaware of the full truth. It was published in medical journals. It was considered legitimate science. In some circles, it was even praised. It wasn't until 1972, after a whistleblower named Peter Buxton leaked the story to the press, that public outrage finally shut it down. By then, over 100 men had died, dozens of family members had been infected, and the reputation of American medicine, especially among black communities, was permanently scarred. The fallout was enormous. A class action lawsuit followed. In 1997, 25 years after the experiment ended, President Bill Clinton formally apologized, stating what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry. But for many, the damage was beyond apology. The Tuskegee syphilis study wasn't just a failure of ethics. It was a demonstration of how institutional racism and scientific arrogance can intertwine to dehumanize an entire community, treating them not as patients, but as subjects, objects, and statistics. It left a legacy of distrust that still lingers today. Many members of the African American community remain understandably skeptical of the medical system. And perhaps they should be. The history is real. The pain was real. And the silence, for decades, was deafening. If there's any lesson to be learned from Tuskegee, it's this. The pursuit of knowledge does not excuse the betrayal of human dignity. Once medicine crosses that line, it ceases to be healing and becomes horror. What binds all these horrifying stories together, from ice-pick lobotomies to psychological warfare, from silent poisonings to watching people die, is not just the scale of the damage done, but the quiet confidence with which it was done. These were not crimes carried out in the dark. They were documented, published, and praised. They wore the mask of science. And that may be the most chilling part of all. In every case, curiosity outpaced compassion. Innovation ignored morality. And human lives, often marginalized, voiceless, or vulnerable, became mere instruments for discovery. Some of these experiments were fueled by war, others by ambition, and some by nothing more than arrogant certainty that the end justifies the means. But history tells a different story. These weren't necessary evils. They were avoidable atrocities. Today, we have ethics boards, consent forms, and human rights declarations, safeguards born from the ashes of these very stories. And yet, the question remains, how far would we go in the name of knowledge if no one was watching? Science, at its best, serves humanity. But when power, prestige, or ideology override empathy, the lab becomes a dungeon, and the scientists become the monsters. Let history be a warning. Curiosity must always be matched by conscience.